This video reveals the unpopular truths behind Socrates' words, his decisions, and his mindset. Ideas historians rarely emphasize and schools never teach. There was a man in ancient Athens who walked barefoot through the marketplace, dressed in rags, asking questions that made the most powerful people in Greece want him dead. He never wrote a single word, he owned almost nothing, he claimed to know nothing, and yet, 2,400 years after his execution, every university, every court of law, every scientific laboratory, and every therapy session in the Western world operates on principles this man established. But here's what they don't teach you in philosophy class. The Socrates you think you know, the wise old sage calmly debating ideas, that's a sanitized version. The real Socrates was far more dangerous, far more radical, and far more useful for your life right now than anything you've been told. Today, I'm going to share 7 things about Socrates that historians mention in footnotes but never emphasize. 7 principles that the philosophy establishment doesn't want to highlight because they're too confrontational, too uncomfortable, too effective. And I guarantee that by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Athenian government sentenced this man to death and why learning what he actually taught might be the most dangerous thing you do today. So what did Socrates really say that was so threatening? Was it about politics? Partially. Was it about religion? In a way. Was it about morality? Closer. Here's the thing. Socrates didn't just question beliefs. He didn't just challenge ideas. He did something far more unsettling. He proved that most people, including the most successful, the most powerful, the most respected people in society, had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. And he did it in public, in front of crowds. He would approach generals, politicians, poets, craftsmen, priests, and ask them simple questions about concepts they claimed to understand: justice, courage, wisdom, love, beauty. And then, question by question, like pulling a thread that unravels an entire garment, he would demonstrate that their confident answers were built on nothing: contradictions, assumptions, inherited opinions they'd never examined. Imagine doing that today. Imagine approaching your CEO, your senator, your spiritual leader, your tenured professor, and proving in front of everyone that they're speaking confidently about things they don't actually understand. How long would that person last? Socrates lasted about 70 years, until Athens had enough. But before they killed him, he developed a method of thinking that would change human consciousness forever. And within that method are 7 specific practices, 7 mental weapons that most people never learn because they're too threatening to the social order. These 7 principles aren't just historical curiosities. Each one is a tool you can use today to build a mind that cannot be manipulated, cannot be broken, and cannot be stopped. Are you ready to see what they are? Let's go. Principle 1. Strategic ignorance as power. Here's the first thing about Socrates that gets completely misunderstood. When he said, "I know that I know nothing," most people think he was being humble. He wasn't. This was a weapon. Listen carefully. In Athens, like today, social power came from appearing to be an expert. The sophists, traveling teachers who Socrates despised, would charge enormous fees to teach young men how to argue, how to win debates, how to appear wise. They sold certainty. Socrates did the opposite. He weaponized uncertainty. Here's how it worked. When someone made a claim, instead of arguing against it, Socrates would say, "I don't understand. Can you explain?" And then he would ask clarifying questions, simple ones. Questions that on the surface made him look slow, confused, maybe even stupid. "What do you mean by justice? Can you give me an example? Does that apply in all cases? What about this situation?" And here's the brilliant part. By positioning himself as ignorant, as someone who genuinely needed help understanding, he removed the defensive barriers people naturally put up. They weren't arguing with him, they were educating him. Except they couldn't. Because once you actually try to define and defend concepts you've taken for granted your whole life, you realize you can't do it. The contradictions emerge, the gaps appear, the confidence crumbles. Now, here's how you use this today. The next time someone is pushing an agenda, selling you something, trying to convince you of their way, don't argue, don't debate, don't present counter-evidence, just ask questions. How do you know that's true? What would change your mind? Can you help me understand the reasoning? You'll discover something Socrates knew. Most people are running software they've never examined. They're repeating phrases they've heard, defending positions they inherited, confident about things they've never actually thought through. And when you ask genuine questions, not rhetorical ones, not gotcha questions, but real inquiries seeking understanding, one of two things happens. Either they'll realize their position needs work and you'll both learn something, or they'll get angry, defensive, and try to shut down the conversation. That anger, that's not about you. That's the sound of someone's worldview being threatened. That's the exact reaction Socrates got every day. And it's proof the technique is working. Strategic ignorance isn't weakness, it's the ultimate test of truth. Because real knowledge can survive questioning, it's only false certainty that needs to silence questions to survive. Socrates taught us this. In a world full of people selling you answers, questions are your greatest protection.
Principle 2. The unexamined life strategy. This is probably the most famous thing Socrates ever said, but I'd bet everything I own that you've never heard what it actually means. The unexamined life is not worth living. Most people think this means you should think deeply about things sometimes. Maybe journal, maybe meditate, reflect on your choices occasionally. That's not what Socrates meant. At his trial, when he was literally being sentenced to death, Socrates said this, and what he meant was radical, extreme, and totally uncompromising. A life without constant, rigorous self-examination is worse than death. Not less fulfilling, not missing something, worse than not existing at all. Think about what that actually means. Socrates is saying that if you're walking through life on autopilot, following scripts handed to you by your culture, your family, your peer group, pursuing goals you never chose, believing things you never questioned, reacting to situations based on conditioning you never examined, you're not really alive. You're a biological robot. You're sophisticated meat running someone else's programming. And here's the thing that nobody wants to confront. This describes most people most of the time. Think about your last week. How many of your decisions did you actually consciously make versus how many were just automatic responses? When you got angry, did you choose that response or did it just happen? When you felt afraid, did you examine whether the fear was rational or did you just react? When you scrolled social media for an hour, was that a deliberate choice about how to spend your limited time on Earth, or did your thumb just do it? Socrates wasn't trying to depress people with this idea, he was trying to wake them up. He spent every single day in the marketplace doing what he called examining himself and others. He would question his own assumptions, test his own beliefs, challenge his own desires. Why do I want this? Is this actually good or does it just feel good? Am I pursuing this because I chose it or because everyone else is? What am I afraid of, and is that fear serving me? Here's your practical application, and I'm warning you, if you actually do this, it will change everything. Once a day, just once, stop and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Not what you're doing, why? You're going to work, why? To make money. Why do you want money? To survive, to be comfortable, to feel secure. Why do those things matter? Keep going. Keep digging. You're pursuing a relationship. Why? Because I love them. What does that mean? What is love? How do you know it's real? You're angry at someone. Why? Because they disrespected me. What is respect? Why does it matter? What happens if you don't have it? Most people never get past the surface level. They live their entire lives never asking why, and then they reach the end and realize they lived someone else's idea of a good life. Socrates refused to do that. He said, essentially, "I would rather die examining truth than live accepting lies." And that's exactly what happened. They gave him the choice: stop asking questions or die. He chose death because an unexamined life wasn't worth living to him. The question is it worth living to you? Principle 3. Wisdom through irritation. Socrates had a nickname in Athens. People called him the gadfly. A gadfly is a fly that bites livestock, that irritates horses and cattle, that won't leave them alone, that keeps them agitated and moving. And Socrates was proud of this comparison. Now, let me translate what this really means. Socrates believed that his purpose was to be annoying. Not entertaining, not comforting, not validating, annoying. And here's the thing that modern philosophy completely misses. This wasn't a side effect of his teaching. This was the teaching. Socrates understood something that every therapist, every good teacher, every effective coach knows. People don't change when they're comfortable. They change when they're disturbed. Think about your own life. When did you actually grow? When did you make real changes? Was it when everything was easy and everyone was telling you that you were fine? No, it was when something disturbed you, when someone challenged you, when reality smacked you in the face and forced you to adapt. Socrates weaponized this principle. He would deliberately say things designed to disturb people out of their comfortable assumptions. To a general proud of his courage, he'd ask, "Is courage always good? What about the courage to do something evil?" To a religious person confident in their piety, he'd ask, "Do the gods love something because it's good, or is it good because the gods love it?" To a democratic citizen proud of their freedom, he'd ask, "Should the uneducated vote on technical matters they don't understand?" These weren't hypothetical philosophy games. These were attacks on the foundational beliefs people built their identities on, and people hated him for it. But here's what Socrates knew that you need to understand. If an idea is true, it can survive being challenged. If a belief is valid, it can withstand questions. If your worldview is solid, being irritated by questions will strengthen it, not destroy it. But if your beliefs are fragile, if your identity is built on unexamined assumptions, if your confidence comes from never being challenged, then questions feel like attacks. Curiosity feels like hostility. Examination feels like destruction. So here's how you use this principle. Be your own gadfly. Deliberately irritate yourself. Question the things you're most certain about. Challenge the beliefs you defend most aggressively. Examine the identities you cling to most tightly. Because those aren't your weaknesses. The things you can't question, the ideas you can't examine, the beliefs you get angry defending, those aren't your strengths. They're your blind spots. And yes, this is uncomfortable. Yes, this is annoying. Yes, you will resist it. That's the point. The discomfort is the work. The irritation is the tool. The resistance is the signal that you found something that needs examination. Socrates didn't seek comfort. He sought truth. And truth is often uncomfortable before it's liberating. So ask yourself, would you rather be comfortable and wrong or disturbed and growing? Socrates made his choice. Athens killed him for it. What's your choice?
Principle 4. Poverty as freedom technology. Here's something nobody talks about. Socrates was deliberately poor. Not couldn't afford nice things poor. Not struggling to make ends meet poor. Strategically, intentionally, philosophically poor. And he believed this was essential to freedom. In ancient Athens, Socrates could have been wealthy. He could have been a sophist, charging fees for teaching. He had students from rich families who offered to pay him. He had opportunities for financial advancement. He rejected all of it. He wore the same simple tunic every day. He walked barefoot. He owned almost nothing. His wife, Xanthippe, was reportedly furious about this. Here was a brilliant man who could provide for his family, and he refused. Why? Because Socrates understood something about human psychology that modern consumer culture desperately doesn't want you to know.
Every possession you own owns you back. Every object you buy requires your energy. It needs to be maintained, protected, stored, worried about, insured, upgraded, eventually replaced. Every nice thing you own creates a vulnerability. It can be taken from you. It can be damaged. It can be stolen. And once you have nice things, you need to make money to keep them, which means you need to keep your job, which means you need to stay in the good graces of your employer, your clients, your customers, which means you can't afford to say what you really think. Socrates had nothing to lose. They couldn't threaten his career because he didn't have one. They couldn't threaten his property because he didn't have any. They couldn't threaten his reputation because he'd already positioned himself as the guy who knows nothing. The only thing they could threaten was his life. And when they finally did, he said, essentially, go ahead. This is what made him dangerous. This is what made him free. Now, I'm not telling you to give everything you own and live in rags. Socrates had a family in ancient Athens with different survival requirements than you have now. But here's what you need to understand. Every need you create in your life is a chain. You need the expensive car, which means you need the high-paying job, which means you can't risk speaking up when your company does something unethical. You need the big house in the nice neighborhood, which means you need to maintain appearances, which means you can't afford to be different, weird, or controversial. You need the latest technology, the designer clothes, the luxury vacations, which means you need to maintain a certain income level, which means you're trapped in a cycle of earning and spending that never ends. Socrates looked at this trap and said, no. He said, I will own so little that I cannot be controlled. Here's your application. Look at your life. Identify the things you need, not water and food and shelter, the other stuff, the things you tell yourself you can't live without, the streaming services, the eating out, the new clothes every season, the car upgrade, the bigger apartment. Now ask yourself Socrates' question. Does this thing give me more freedom or less? If you're honest, really honest, most of the things you think you need are actually making you less free. You're working more hours to afford things that don't improve your life. You're stressed about money to maintain a lifestyle that doesn't make you happier. You're trapped in jobs you hate to pay for possessions that don't matter. Socrates would say you're enslaved, and the path to freedom is simpler than you think. Need less, want less, own less. I'm not saying be miserable, I'm saying be strategic. Every possession is a trade-off. Make sure you're getting more than you're giving. Socrates walked barefoot through Athens and felt more free than kings in their palaces. What would your life look like if you needed less?
Principle 5. Dialogue over monologue. Here's something subtle but revolutionary about Socrates. He never gave lectures. Never. He never stood in front of a crowd and delivered a speech about truth. He never wrote a treatise on justice. He never published the Socratic method, a guide to wisdom. Everything he did was dialogue, conversation, questions and answers, back and forth with individuals or small groups. And this wasn't just a stylistic choice. This was philosophical bedrock. Socrates believed that truth couldn't be transmitted like data. You couldn't pour it into someone's head like liquid into a cup. You couldn't lecture someone into wisdom. Instead, truth had to be discovered internally by the person themselves. Think about the difference. When someone lectures you, when someone tells you what to think, even if they're right, you're passive. You're receiving information. And because you're passive, you don't really own it. It's their idea that you've borrowed. But when someone asks you questions, when they force you to think through a problem yourself, when you arrive at a conclusion through your own reasoning, that's yours. You own it. You understand it. You can defend it.
and you can apply it. This is why reading self-help books doesn't usually help. This is why watching motivational videos doesn't create lasting change. This is why hearing advice, even good advice, rarely works. Because it's monologue. It's someone telling you things, and your brain categorizes it as information and files it away unused. But when you think through something yourself, when you wrestle with questions, when you discover answers through your own mental effort, that creates neural pathways. That changes your brain structure. That becomes part of you. Here's how you use this. Stop looking for people to give you answers. Start looking for people who will ask you questions. Stop trying to convince people by explaining your position. Start asking questions that help them discover it themselves. Your friend is stuck in a bad relationship. You could say, "They're toxic, you should leave." That's monologue, and they'll defend the relationship and ignore you. Or you could ask, "How do you feel after spending time with them? Is that how you want to feel in a relationship? What would have to change for this to work? Do you think that's likely?" Those questions do the work, not your answers, their answers. Socrates knew that people don't resist their own conclusions. They only resist other people's conclusions. So if you want to help someone, don't tell them what you figured out. Help them figure it out themselves. And if you want to learn something deeply, don't just read about it or listen to podcasts about it. Ask yourself questions about it. Argue with yourself. Play devil's advocate against your own position. Force yourself to articulate your reasoning. This is why Socrates was so effective. He didn't tell people they were wrong. He asked questions until they told themselves they were wrong. And that's a lesson they never forgot. The next time you want to share wisdom, don't. Share questions instead. That's the Socratic way.
Principle 6. The courage to die for what you believe. We need to talk about how Socrates died, because this is where philosophy became real. In 399 BC, Socrates was put on trial. The charges were corrupting the youth of Athens and not believing in the gods of the state. The real reason? He was annoying. He made powerful people look foolish. He questioned things that weren't supposed to be questioned. He was found guilty. But here's what most people don't know. The trial system in Athens was designed to allow exile as an alternative to execution. Socrates could have proposed exile as his punishment. The jury probably would have accepted it. He could have left Athens, continued teaching elsewhere, lived another decade or two. He refused. Instead, during the penalty phase, Socrates made a speech that essentially guaranteed his execution. He said that instead of being punished, he should be rewarded. He said the city should provide him free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the building where Olympic heroes and benefactors were honored. He said that his crime of questioning people and making them examine their beliefs was the greatest service anyone had ever done for Athens. Can you imagine standing trial for your life and telling the jury they should be thanking you instead? He got the death penalty. But it still wasn't over. Athenian law allowed a 30-day waiting period before execution. During this time, Socrates' friends, including his wealthy student Crito, arranged an escape plan. They bribed the guards, they had horses ready, they had a safe house in Thessaly arranged. All Socrates had to do was leave his cell at night and go. He refused again. Instead, Socrates said essentially, "I've spent my entire life arguing that people should follow reason and principle over emotion and self-interest. I've spent decades saying living well matters more than simply living. If I run now, I'm admitting that I didn't believe any of it. I'm admitting that when the stakes got real, my principles were just talk. And if that's true, then my entire life was a lie." So he drank the hemlock, poison. He spent his final hours discussing philosophy with his students. When the poison started working, moving from his feet upward toward his heart, he remained calm. His last words, according to Plato, were, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing. Owing him a rooster was what you did when you recovered from an illness. Socrates' final statement was that death was a healing, that life was the illness, that he was finally becoming free. Now, here's why this matters for you. Socrates proved that he believed what he taught, completely, all the way to death. How many people can say that? How many people have principles they would die for? More importantly, how many people have principles they'll even be mildly inconvenienced for? You say you believe in honesty, but will you risk your job to tell the truth? You say you believe in integrity, but will you lose money to do the right thing? You say you believe in justice, but will you face social consequences to defend someone? Most people won't. Most people's beliefs are preferences, not principles. They believe things as long as it's comfortable, convenient, and cost-free. Socrates didn't. I'm not suggesting you should die for your beliefs. Socrates didn't seek martyrdom. He didn't want to die. He just refused to live as a hypocrite. But here's what you can do. Figure out what you actually believe, not what you say you believe, not what you think you should believe, what you actually believe. And then ask yourself, what am I willing to sacrifice for this? Your time, your money, your comfort, your reputation, your relationships. Because if you're not willing to sacrifice anything for a belief, it's not a belief, it's a preference. It's a nice idea you like entertaining. Socrates showed us that real belief requires real courage, the willingness to suffer for what's true, the willingness to lose for what's right, the willingness, if necessary, to die for what matters. You probably won't face that ultimate choice, but you'll face smaller versions every single day. And each time you choose comfort over principle, you become less than who you could be. Each time you choose safety over truth, you betray yourself. Socrates walked into his cell, drank the poison, and died free. Most people walk into their graves having never lived free at all. Which will you be?
Principle 7. Internal authority over external validation. Okay, this last one is the strangest, the most misunderstood, and possibly the most important thing about Socrates. He claimed to have an inner voice. He called it his daimonion, his divine sign. And he said this voice would speak to him, not to tell him what to do, but to warn him what not to do. When he was about to make a mistake, the voice would stop him. Now, was this literally a voice? Was it intuition? Was it highly developed self-awareness? Was it what we'd call conscience? Doesn't matter. Here's what matters. Socrates trusted his internal guidance more than any external authority. Think about what this means in practice. When the majority of Athens voted against him, he didn't change his position. When the laws of the state demanded he stop philosophizing, he didn't comply. When social pressure, legal pressure, and threat of death all pushed him to conform, he listened to something deeper, his internal compass. And this is the ultimate lesson of Socrates. This is what ties everything together. Your mind, when properly examined and trained, is a more reliable guide than any external authority. Not the government, not the experts, not the tradition, not the majority, not the priests, not your parents, not your peer group, not your culture. Your own carefully examined, rigorously questioned, honestly investigated mind. Now listen carefully, because this is where people get Socrates wrong. He's not saying do whatever you feel like. He's not saying your opinion is automatically valid. He's not promoting narcissism or selfishness or ignoring others. Remember, this is the guy who spent every day questioning his own assumptions. This is the guy who said he knew nothing. This is the guy who constantly tested his own beliefs. Socrates is saying, after you've done the work, after you've examined the options, after you've questioned yourself brutally and honestly, after you've considered other perspectives, trust what remains. Trust what survives the examination. Here's how this plays out in your life. You know deep down when something is wrong. Your internal voice tells you. But then external pressure mounts. Your family says you should stay in that career. Your friends say you should stay in that relationship.
Society says you should want that lifestyle. The economy says you should make that choice, and you override your internal knowing. You silence your daemonion. And then years later, you look back and realize, I knew the whole time. I just didn't trust myself. This is the tragedy Socrates wanted to prevent. He wanted people to develop their inner voice so strongly, to trust their examined judgment so deeply that no external pressure could sway them from what they knew was true. So here's your final practice. Start listening to yourself. Not the surface you, not your anxieties or your impulses or your conditioned reactions. The deep you, the part that knows. It speaks quietly, usually not in words. It's a feeling of rightness or wrongness, a sense of alignment or disalignment, a clarity that cuts through confusion. Everyone has it. Most people ignore it. Socrates is telling you to stop ignoring it. Build a relationship with that inner voice. Question it, yes, test it. Make sure it's not just fear or desire in disguise. But once you've done that work, once you've examined it thoroughly, trust it more than anything else. Because here's what Socrates ultimately proved. When you trust your internal authority, when you've examined yourself so thoroughly that you know who you are and what you believe, when you've built a mind that cannot be confused or manipulated or scared into betraying itself, you become free. Not comfortable, not safe, not popular, but free. They killed Socrates' body, but they never touched his mind. They couldn't, because he had built something inside himself that was beyond their reach. And that's what he's offering you, the same freedom, if you're brave enough to do the work.
Look, I get it. This is heavy stuff. Socrates isn't easy. He's not comfortable. He's not the kind of philosopher you read to feel good about yourself. But here's why I think he matters now more than ever. We live in a time of infinite information and zero wisdom. Everyone's an expert. Everyone's certain. Everyone's got an opinion on everything. And they're all screaming those opinions at maximum volume. And in the middle of all that noise, you're supposed to figure out what's true, what matters, what's worth believing, and what's worth fighting for. How? Socrates gives you a method, not answers, a method. I know you're tired. I know you're overwhelmed. I know you've got 1,000 things demanding your attention, and the last thing you need is some ancient Greek philosopher telling you to question everything. But that's exactly what you need. Because here's what I've learned and what Socrates knew. The examined life isn't harder than the unexamined life. It's actually easier. It's easier because you're not carrying other people's expectations. You're not defending positions you don't actually believe. You're not pursuing goals that don't matter to you. You're not afraid of questions because you've already asked them yourself. The unexamined life feels easier at first. You just go with the flow. You don't rock the boat. You accept what you're told. You do what's expected. But it's slowly suffocating. Every day you live that way, you become less yourself, more a copy of what others want you to be, more a product of your conditioning, less alive. And one day you wake up and realize you've been asleep your whole life. Socrates doesn't want that for you. I don't want that for you. You don't have to become Socrates. You don't have to walk barefoot through the marketplace questioning strangers. You don't have to own nothing and live in poverty. You don't have to drink hemlock to prove a point. But you can borrow his method. You can ask yourself the questions he asked. You can examine your life the way he examined his. You can build a mind that's free. And when you do, something shifts. The world doesn't become easier, but you become stronger. Problems don't disappear, but you face them with clarity. People don't stop trying to manipulate you, but you see through it. You become unbreakable in a way that has nothing to do with toughness and everything to do with truth. That's what Socrates offers. Not happiness, not success, not comfort, but something better. Integrity, authenticity, freedom. The kind of life where, when you put your head on the pillow at night, You know you lived as you that day. Not as who you're supposed to be, not as who others want you to be, as you. And if that sounds appealing, if some part of you is responding to this, if you feel that pull towards something more real, then you're already on the path Socrates walked. Welcome. It's not an easy path, but it's yours.
Okay, we need to talk about what really happened with Socrates, because there's a secret hidden in his story, something that changes everything once you see it. Why did Athens really kill him? The official charges were corrupting youth and impiety, but those were pretexts. Socrates had been teaching for decades without serious trouble. Other philosophers said more radical things about the gods and weren't executed. So what changed? Here's what I think happened, what historians hint at but never fully articulate. Socrates created something that terrifies every power structure throughout all of human history. He created thinking individuals. Not people with opinions, not people with beliefs, not people with education. People who could think for themselves, independently, critically, without need for external authority. And here's the secret they don't teach in school. Every system of control, every government, every institution, every ideology, every religion, every corporation, every social movement, all of them require the same thing to function: people who don't question them. Not necessarily people who agree with them, just people who accept that the system itself is legitimate, that the authorities have the right to authority, that the rules are real. Socrates broke that spell. He showed that every authority figure, when questioned, couldn't defend their authority. Every expert, when examined, revealed gaps in their expertise. Every tradition, when investigated, showed contradictions in its logic. He proved that the emperor has no clothes, and then he taught others to see it too. That's why they killed him. Not because he was wrong, not because he was dangerous to individuals, but because he was dangerous to the system itself. A population of people using the Socratic method, asking questions, examining assumptions, thinking for themselves, cannot be controlled. They can't be manipulated by propaganda because they question the premises. They can't be scared into compliance because they examine their fears. They can't be bought because they've questioned what they actually need. They can't be shamed because they've examined their own values. This is what Socrates discovered, and why his method is still revolutionary 2,400 years later. The examined mind is ungovernable. Not rebellious, not anarchic, not anti-authority just for the sake of it, just ungovernable. Because governance requires people to accept things without examination, to obey without understanding, to comply without questioning. And Socrates taught the opposite. Now, look at your world today. Look at how much energy is spent trying to get you to stop thinking, to accept narratives, to pick a side, to stay in your lane, to trust the experts, to support the troops, to buy the product, to join the movement, to believe the story. Every advertisement is designed to bypass your critical thinking. Every political speech uses emotional manipulation instead of logical argument. Every news story presents a frame that precludes certain questions. Every social media platform optimizes for engagement, not truth. The entire system is designed to keep you from doing what Socrates taught. Because if you actually did it, if you actually examined everything, if you actually questioned every assumption and tested every claim and followed every argument to its logical conclusion, the system would lose its power over you. Not all of it. You'd still need to eat, you'd still be subject to physical laws, you'd still face real constraints, but the mental chains, the psychological manipulation, the social conditioning, the fear and shame that keep you in line, those would break. And that's the real revelation here. That's what Socrates is actually offering you. He's offering you the key to your own cage. The cage isn't made of metal, it's made of unexamined assumptions, inherited beliefs, unchallenged fears, unquestioned desires, social programming disguised as personal preference, cultural programming disguised as universal truth. And most people never even realize they're in a cage because they've never tested the bars. Socrates is telling you to test them. Question everything you think you know. Examine every belief you hold. Challenge every authority you accept. Investigate every desire you feel.
And here's what happens when you do. Some of your beliefs will break. They should. They were false. Some of your desires will fade. They should. They weren't really yours. Some of your fears will dissolve. They should. They were keeping you small. Some of your certainties will crumble. They should. They were built on sand. But what remains, what survives that examination, what stands up to rigorous questioning, that's real. That's true. That's yours. And when you've done that work, when you've examined yourself thoroughly, when you've questioned everything and kept only what survives the questioning, you become like Socrates in that prison cell, free. Not because your circumstances are free, but because your mind is free. They can threaten your job, and it won't control you, because you've examined what you actually need. They can threaten your reputation, and it won't sway you, because you've examined what actually matters. They can threaten your comfort, and it won't break you, because you've examined what makes life worth living. They can even threaten your life, and if you've truly done the work, you'll face it like Socrates did, with calm, with clarity, with integrity intact. This is what they don't tell you about Socrates. He wasn't teaching philosophy, he was teaching liberation. Not political liberation, not economic liberation, not social liberation, mental liberation. The kind that no one can give you and no one can take away. The kind that turns you into someone who cannot be manipulated, cannot be broken, cannot be stopped. That's why Athens killed him. That's why his method is still dangerous today. That's why you've probably never heard Socrates taught this way. Because if everyone learned this, if everyone actually practiced the Socratic method, if everyone examined their lives the way Socrates examined his, the entire game would change. Not overnight, not easily, but inevitably. Socrates planted a seed 2,400 years ago. A method, a practice, a way of being. And that seed is still here, waiting to grow in anyone brave enough to use it.